This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for the 49th edition of Deck History. In this series, I trace the history of prominent Magic archetypes from their origins to the current day. As usual, I ran a poll last week that gave viewers a chance to choose the topic of this week's video, and Lantern Control beat out Enchantress. Lantern Control is one of the wackier decks to ever emerge as a Tier 1 force in any format, mostly because it used a whole assortment of cards that were widely considered pretty useless. Lantern Control is a modern prison deck that does everything it can to control what cards the opponent draws, while slowly milling them out. It accomplishes this with the eponymous Lantern of Insight and various effects that let you mill one card at a time. Basically, the goal is to make sure the opponent never draws anything useful, and the deck is surprisingly effective at making that happen. It's never been a deck in any format other than Modern, so we've only got one format to talk about this time around. The deck made its debut at Grand Prix Oklahoma City in 2015, and it pretty much came out of nowhere to win the entire event in the hands of the deck's inventor, Zach Elsick. So let's dive in with a look at his deck. As I noted, the deck's main game plan is to completely control what the opponent draws. This is accomplished by getting information with Lantern of Insight, and then utilizing Ghoul Caller's Bell and or Codex Shredder to get rid of anything potentially problematic your opponent might draw. Basically, the deck's goal is to make it as likely as possible that you experience one of the worst things in all of Magic. You draw useless cards. To do that, you also have to know everything about your opponent's hand, because you can't really know what your opponent needs without that information. This could be accomplished while also disrupting your opponent with Inquisition of Kozilek, Surgical Extraction, and Thoughtseize. The deck could win by milling the opponent out slowly, but it did feature some other win conditions. The deck was mostly made up of artifacts, so you could use Ghirapur Ether Grid to ping the opponent to death. Alternatively, you can create a loop with Academy Ruins and Pyrite Spellbomb to do 2 damage to your opponent every turn, while you continue to make them draw useless cards. Obviously, the deck also needed to find a way to lock down the board, because if your opponent plays creatures before you take control of what they draw, you do need to do something about them. This is accomplished primarily with Ensnaring Bridge, which shuts down any creature-based deck, and most of the decks in Modern at the time had to win by attacking you one way or another. Whether it was Affinity, Splinter Twin, Merfolk, or Red deck wins, you usually had to attack, and this deck made it so you couldn't. While the original version of Lantern Control we see here didn't have a straight-up tutor to grab all the pieces that you need, Ancient Stirrings often felt like one, because you got to go 5 deep and grab an artifact or land that you needed. One of the great things about this deck was that none of the cards in it were new, with the exception of Ghirapur Ether Grid. A lot of the time when a new deck shows up, it's because some new card made it happen, but that's not true here. Everything that was key in the deck had been around forever, including the deck's core of the Lantern, Ghoul Caller's Bell, and Codex Shredder, but nobody had found a use for any of them. Well, now someone had. The metagame was completely unprepared for this powerful deck, leading to Zach's dominance of the event, and on that day in Oklahoma City, a new Tier 1 deck was born into Modern. By 2016, the deck did not look drastically different, but there were a few changes. The very same player, Zach Elsick, top-8'd a Magic Online Modern Championship that year. The biggest changes to the deck were the additions of Collective Brutality and Pyxis of Pandemonium. Brutality gave you another effect that let you see the contents of your opponent's hand, and it had a whole lot of other useful modal options. The Pyxis gave you another card that let you get rid of problematic cards on top of your opponent's library. The deck also no longer utilized any sort of damage to win games. There's no Ether Grid or Spellbomb here. Instead, the deck is just leaning on slowly milling the opponent out. By 2017, the deck still hadn't undergone any major change, but the deck did utilize 2 new important lands, Inventor's Fair and Spire of Industry. The Fair gained you life if you had enough artifacts, which could help prolong your life before you got your lock pieces in play, and it could even tutor up some of those important cards. Spire of Industry, meanwhile, gave you a way to produce mana of any color, since you pretty much always had an artifact in play. Later in 2017, a new card from Aether Revolt really changed the deck. Whir of Invention. This powerful tutor allows you to search up an artifact and put it directly on the battlefield, and it's an instant. It also comes with Improvise, and the deck's plethora of cheap artifacts mean you could search up virtually any artifact in your deck and put it on the table when you needed it. If you really needed to get the bridge online so you don't die, you could grab that. If you really needed to find your lantern or codex shredder, you could get those too. This gave the deck a bit more of a toolbox angle, as the deck could now run singleton copies of some situational artifacts, like Grafdigger's Cage and Witchbane Orb. The Cage was good for shutting down graveyard decks that could potentially benefit from you milling them, and the Orb could protect you from burn and other targeted effects that the bridge doesn't stop. This also allowed the deck to go back to the Pyrite Spellbomb win condition, as you could search up your singleton copy to win the game when you needed it. Sam Black would be the next and last player to pilot a new version of Lantern Control to a top 8 finish at a Modern event, which he did at Grand Prix Tampa in 2019. His deck's most interesting addition was Kaya Orzhov Usurper. She could perform the double duty of exiling problematic cards from the graveyard, and she could also serve as a win condition with her ultimate, which would often do lethal damage as a result of the cards the deck exiles. However, while this was the end of decks we can truly call Lantern Control, there is another deck that is a descendant of the Lantern Control deck, and it actually first showed up in 2018. We can't call this kind of deck a Lantern Control deck, because it no longer makes use of Lantern of Insight, or the original deck's game plan. However, it's still an artifact-based prison deck, and it has taken on the name Lantern-less Control. The deck still uses Whir of Invention and Ensnaring Bridge, and runs a few of the same artifacts, but the deck's biggest difference is that it is a different sort of prison deck altogether. It no longer tried to control what the opponent drew, and instead added cards like Chalice of the Void, Damping Sphere, and Sorceress Spyglass to the mix. This allowed the deck to hate on some specific strategies, even in the main deck. The deck could win the game with that old Pyrite Spellbomb loop, or by using Ipnu Rivulet over and over alongside Crucible of Worlds. One other sweet thing was that the deck combined Bottled Cloister with Ensnaring Bridge. This meant you could still hold onto a grip of cards on your turn, while also continuing to shut down your opponent's creatures. Lanternless control decks also eventually transformed when the Modern format underwent drastic change as a result of the release of Modern Horizons in 2019. The deck you see here is no longer really a prison deck. Instead, it utilizes powerful artifact payoffs like Urza, Lord High Artificer, and Goblin Engineer. One of the deck's main plans is to utilize Thopter Foundry with Sword of the Meek. Every single turn, for every mana you have, you can put a 1/1 Thopter token into play, because every time you make one, the sword returns to the battlefield and attaches itself to the Thopter, and then you can sacrifice the sword again, make another 1/1, and it comes back again. So while this deck is drastically different from what we've been talking about in this video, it is certainly a descendant of Lantern Control and Lanternless Control. So that's the history of Lantern Control. It emerged on the scene seemingly out of nowhere in 2015, and it left a pretty big mark on the Modern format between 2015 and 2019, and decks descended from it are still relevant in Modern today. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the almost 50 other episodes of Deck History, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. If you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a patron, by becoming a channel member, or by buying Nitsa Hone merch. You can find ways to do all of that in the description. Thanks for watching.